On to today's program. We're going to start with a presentation that covers an overview of the key macroeconomic and geopolitical trends, followed by our first panel discussion on the implication of those trends on financial statements for preparers and auditors. And then, after the break, the second panel will discuss the challenges that the evolving landscape of climate disclosures may pose for public companies and auditors, particularly in light of the SEC's proposed rule on climate-related disclosures. The panel will also discuss how companies and auditors can effectively prepare in advance of the SEC's final rule. To get us started, I'd like to welcome someone I know incredibly well, Ira Kalish. Ira is our Deloitte Chief Global Economist, and he advises leaders and clients on global macroeconomic trends and their impact on the business environment. I've heard him very, very recently, and I think you're going to find some of the things he'll share with you incredibly insightful. After Ira's presentation, Wes Bricker, the Vice Chair of U.S. Trust Solutions and co-leader at PwC, will join Ira on stage to field audience questions, which can be submitted through the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So welcome, Ira, and we do look forward to your discussion.
Thank you, Laura, and good day, everybody. Nice to be with you. What I'd like to do is walk you through my thinking about where the economy is going, mainly the U.S. economy, but at the end, I'll be happy to take questions about other parts of the world as well. So why don't we begin? The biggest question that I've been getting from clients recently has been, are we in a recession, or is a recession imminent? And my answers have cautiously been no and no. But it's important to first begin with the discussion as to why there is this question about the recession. The reason that we're getting questions about recession, the main reason is that we're now seeing a tightening of monetary policy by the Federal Reserve and other central banks. And that is in response to the very high, historically high rate of inflation that we're now experiencing. So I think it's useful to begin with a discussion about how we got to where we are with respect to inflation. So if I could have the next slide, please. There we go. So what you see here is inflation in both the US, the UK, the Euro area, and Japan. And this is the year-over-year percent change in consumer prices. You can see that we've experienced a very sudden and very dramatic surge in consumer prices. The rate of inflation now is the highest it's been in over 40 years. This came about not because of the usual suspects. We did have monetary and fiscal stimulus, which ordinarily lead to inflation. We did have a dramatic increase in the money supply, and yet we also had a dramatic decrease in the speed at which money changes hands, what we economists call velocity. And that's because a lot of consumers and businesses hoarded cash. We did have a dramatic increase in government spending, fiscal stimulus, but by our estimation, about 75% of the money that went into the hands of households was saved. So my view is that although monetary and fiscal stimulus likely played some role in inflation, it didn't play the dominant role. Instead, the dominant role played first from the pandemic and second from the war in Ukraine. With respect to the pandemic, it had two effects. One, it dramatically changed consumer spending behavior in ways that created bottlenecks in the prices of goods. And second, it disrupted the production and distribution of goods, and that elevated prices. Let's look at the details of this. Next slide, please. So what you see here is real or inflation-adjusted consumer spending, both on services, the red line, and goods, the blue line. You can see that at the start of the pandemic in early 2020, there was a sharp drop in both types of spending as people basically stayed home and did nothing. But then as we came out of the pandemic, there was a dramatic surge in spending on goods. You can see that by early to mid 2021, the level of spending on goods was dramatically higher than the pre-pandemic level or the pre-pandemic path, while spending on services was diminished. And that's because during the pandemic, people avoided social interaction. There were restrictions on going out. People didn't spend money on restaurants and bars, movie theaters, airplanes, hotels. Instead, they spent money on themselves and their homes. They bought home entertainment equipment, electronics, appliances, fitness equipment that they probably didn't use. But in any event, this dramatic increase in spending on goods created bottlenecks for suppliers who were hard pressed to meet that demand. And that in turn led to an increase in prices. But that happened at the same time that there was already stress in supply chains. Next slide, please. And here you can see a measure of supply chain pressure. This is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They measure stress in global supply chains, looking at things like delays and shortages and so on. And what you can see is that during the pandemic, we had a dramatic increase in supply chain stress, which has started to abate somewhat, but we're still at a level far beyond the pre-pandemic level. And this created increased price pressure because consumer spending on goods increased so dramatically. Now, as you may have noticed in the previous chart, consumer spending on goods over the past year has started to decline, while consumer spending on services has increased. And that is a reflection of the fact that consumers now are confident that the pandemic is behind us and we can go back out again, and we're going to restaurants and we're getting on airplanes and we're diminishing our spending on goods. And that in turn should help to alleviate inflation pressure, although spending on goods is still well above the pre-pandemic path. And so there's still some stress on supply chains. And this chart obviously shows that things are starting to get a little bit better. And my view is that if there hadn't been the war in Ukraine, we would already by now have seen inflation peak and start to come down. But then the war came, next slide, please, and led to a dramatic increase in commodity prices, especially energy prices, but also food prices and the prices of key metals and chemicals. So here you can see the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil, which had already been rising sharply even before the war in Ukraine because the global economy was reopening. There was stronger demand for energy. There had not been sufficient investment in new capacity during the pandemic. And then the war came along, disrupting supply. The sanctions also disrupted trade in oil, and prices went up dramatically. And we're seeing that at the gas pump right now. The good news is oil prices have come down quite dramatically over the past 2 or 3 months. And we're now at the point where the price of oil is roughly similar to where it was pre-pandemic. But still, the damage has been done. The inflation we've experienced since March was disproportionately driven by the rise in energy prices, and it still hasn't peaked yet, although my view is that it will. My view is that now that we're seeing a decline in consumer spending on goods, and we're seeing tightening of monetary policy leading to a weakening of the overall economy, now that we've seen commodity prices peak and possibly start to decline, there's reason to expect inflation to come down gradually over the next year to 2 years. Next slide, please. But in any event, the problem that you have with inflation is that once you get inflation, there's the risk that it becomes entrenched or embedded, mainly because of the effect on the labor market. And the fear is that as people's expectations change and they expect inflation to be prolonged, workers will seek bigger wage increases. Businesses will pass on those wage increases to consumers in the form of higher prices. And you get a kind of wage price spiral that makes it more difficult to get inflation under control, which leads us to the US labor market. And it's important to take a look at conditions in the labor market to see if they're likely to generate a wage price spiral. So first, on the left, what you see is the labor force participation rate, which dropped dramatically at the start of the pandemic, bounced back and has been bouncing back, but is still below the pre-pandemic level, which means we don't have as many workers as we should, given that there continues to be strong demand for labor. In fact, the unemployment rate is 3.5%. We saw very strong job growth in the past month. So why is this? Well, during the pandemic, a lot of people left the labor force, especially older people who retired early, and they're not likely coming back. Some parents dropped out because it was difficult to take care of children who weren't in school full time. Now the kids are back in school and people are starting to trickle back into the labor force. Some people dropped out because they lost jobs, say in retail, when stores closed permanently, and they may not have had the skills needed for jobs being created in other industries. And then on top of this drop in labor force participation, we've seen a very sharp drop in immigration. And growth in immigration is important. In fact, in the past decade, immigrants accounted for 70% of the increase in the US labor force. So that absence of immigration and this drop in labor force participation has rendered us with a job shortage. And you can see a labor shortage, I should say. You can see that on the right-hand side. This is the number of job openings. It's the number of available jobs that businesses are hard-pressed to fill. And you can see it's been a dramatic surge. The job openings rate is now close to the highest level we've ever seen. And ordinarily, in this kind of labor market, with a shortage of labor, combined with rising prices, you would expect that wages would be going through the roof. Next slide, please. But that hasn't been the case. Instead, wages have been relatively tame. If you look at this chart, the red line is inflation, once again, having surged since the start of 2021. The blue line is the year-over-year percent change in average hourly wages. You can see wages rose sharply as we came out of the initial pandemic, but then kind of stabilized. And now we're seeing wages rise at a rate of a little over 5% year over year, much below the 9% inflation we're seeing. This means that consumers on average are seeing a significant decline in their real purchasing power, which increases the risk of recession. Interestingly, though, consumer spending has been relatively stable because even though consumers are seeing a loss of purchasing power, they're dipping into the massive savings they accumulated during the pandemic. And so that is helping to stabilize consumer spending. But more importantly, this indicates that we're not experiencing a wage price spiral. Rather, we're seeing a relatively tame labor market. And this may reflect the fact that the Federal Reserve has done a reasonably good job of managing expectations of inflation. If you look at indicators in the bond market of investor expectations of inflation, they remain pretty tame. Investors evidently believe that even though inflation is very high right now, it will fairly rapidly come down, and that over the next couple of years, it will average somewhere between 2 and 3%. And workers have responded to that by not seeking the biggest wage increases, although there are exceptions. One industry that has seen very big wage increases is leisure and hospitality, but most others have not. In fact, many companies, rather than offering big wage increases and getting stuck with much higher wages, are offering retention bonuses or signing bonuses or investing in labor saving or labor augmenting technology in order to boost the productivity of existing workers. Next slide, please. But in any event, we do have high inflation, and the Federal Reserve has responded by tightening monetary policy, as have other central banks around the world. And you can see the impact right here. The blue line is the 3-month Treasury bill, which mimics the federal funds rate that the Federal Reserve controls. And that has increased quite sharply, although it remains far below the rate of inflation. And that will have an impact on things like adjustable rate mortgages. The red line is the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond, which has also increased sharply, although come down a little bit. This chart is about a month old, but the rate is still below 3%. And this reflects the fact that the Fed has stopped purchasing assets and started to unwind its ownership of bonds and reduce its balance sheet. And that has led to this rise in bond yields, which in turn initially led to a rise in mortgage interest rates, which has already had the effect of slowing the housing market. Now, the good news is that long-term yields have, in fact, started to come down, which reflects investor expectations that inflation will come down and also expectations that the economy will weaken, and that will weaken overall demand for credit. But in any event, what the Fed is trying to do is to slow the economy to reduce inflationary pressures and to anchor expectations of inflation. What the Fed cannot do is control the underlying factors that led us to inflation. It can't control the pandemic and the supply chain disruption that entailed. It can't control the war in Ukraine. But the good news is that those factors are starting to move in the direction of lower inflation. So my expectation is that the Fed will be successful in bringing inflation down to a less onerous level, and that over the next 2 years, inflation will come down from the current 9% to somewhere between 2 and 3%. The real question is whether the Fed can engineer this without engineering a recession. And that's the big question right now. Next slide, please. So, as I said at the beginning, I'm getting a lot of questions about recession. Will there be a recession? Yes, of course. Ultimately and eventually, there will be a recession. The business cycle has not been repealed, and there's a significant risk of recession in the next year or two. But will it happen soon or will it happen later? The argument that it will happen soon is that we're seeing a rapid tightening of monetary policy. This has already weakened the housing market. The surge in oil prices has already weakened or reduced real incomes of consumers, and ultimately could lead to a drop in consumer spending, although we haven't seen that yet. Clearly, the inflation has already significantly hurt consumer sentiment. Measures of consumer confidence are at a historic low right now. On top of that, and often not mentioned, is the fact that fiscal policy is contractionary. The budget deficit as a share of GDP will drop this year from last year by the greatest amount since the end of World War II. That has a negative impact on the economy. And finally, poor business sentiment can stifle investment. It's kind of a situation of saying it so makes it so. If business leaders believe that recession is imminent, then they're likely to cut back on hiring and investment, and that can lead us to recession. On the other hand, my view, and many economists agree with this, that if a recession comes, it will be a little bit later, that the job market remains very strong, with employment growing and a labor shortage continuing, that consumers saved a lot during the pandemic, and they're dipping into their savings, and they continue to spend, and that although spending on goods is declining, spending on services is accelerating. Just go to an airport now and look at the amount people are spending on traveling. Next slide, please. And also, these charts give us a sense of what's going on. On the left, this is employment. The red line is the current situation, and the dark black line is the average of post-war recessions. If we had actually started a recession at the start of this year, then we should have mimicked that dark black line, or one of the lighter lines would show all the other recessions, all the recessions of the post-war era. The red line shows that if we've had a recession, we've had the strongest employment growth at the start of a recession ever. And that's not likely. It's not likely we're in a recession. Same thing on the right-hand side with industrial production. Industrial production has been strong, it's been growing, and it's certainly not behaved like it did at the start of previous recessions. So again, I think it's really unlikely we're in recession or that recession is even imminent. But again, the economy is clearly decelerating and there is recession risk. Next slide, please. Now, there are some big geopolitical issues. The war in Ukraine continues to be a serious issue. If Russia gets backed into a corner, it might engage in cyber attacks, which could have a big negative impact on the global economy. Energy markets are certainly being disrupted. And the biggest risk right now, even though oil prices are coming down, natural gas prices in Europe are way up. And there's a fear that Russia could withhold gas from Europe during the winter, which would clearly lead to a big European recession, which would have a negative spillover effect here. And of course, food markets are being severely disrupted right now because of the war in Ukraine. And that could lead to social and political unrest in emerging markets. Next slide, please. Finally, let me close with a comment on globalization, because some people have lately said, well, we're now at the end of the era of globalization. We've seen dramatic disruption of supply chains, and companies are going to bring their supply chains back home because of the disruption. Well, let's talk about how we got to where we are. We've seen 30 or 40 years of globalization, of reduced restrictions on the movement of goods and capital and people, and the development of massive, very efficient supply chains that led to lower prices and faster economic growth. And these supply chains were predicated on an assumption of stability, that companies would have the ability to make reasonable predictions about supply and demand patterns and accordingly develop supply chains that achieved the lowest cost and the highest speed. But in the past few years, we've had massive disruption. We had trade wars, we had the war in Ukraine, we had the pandemic, we've had lockdowns in China. All of this has thrown those predictions out the window, leading to shortages and delays, much higher costs, and now much higher prices and inflation. And this has led some people to think, well, globalization is over. Now we've got to bring supply chains back home. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that globalization is at a pivot point where it becomes a little bit different. And rather than only focus on low cost and high speed, companies will be compelled to focus also on resilience and redundancy, and do that through diversification of supply chains. So we're already seeing companies move some processes, say, out of China to Southeast Asia or India or Mexico or elsewhere. And of course, there's the fraught political relationship between China and the West. So there's also the view that there is future political risk that could undermine supply chains. And so by diversifying, companies are increasingly buying an insurance policy against future risk. And so supply chains will look different going forward, but it doesn't mean the end of globalization. In any event, those are my thoughts on the economy. And I'm happy to take questions. So back to you.
Well, thank you, Ira. This is Wes Bricker. And maybe to just transition into the question period, I wanted to just say thank you. Thank you for a really insightful discussion about the environment in which we're navigating. We do have a handful of questions, and maybe the first one to just get us started, appreciating we're a little bit short on time, is this is a fast-moving area, as you had talked about. Inflation, its then follow-on implications for a recession and so forth. We've also seen legislative proposals and interventions as well. Maybe if you could comment on what you see as the possibility of interventions to change the course of inflation. Would they be effective, not effective? How do you see that?
Well, I think from a policy perspective, the most important thing is monetary policy. And indeed, the Federal Reserve is embarked on a policy of rapid tightening of monetary policy, which should have the effect of suppressing inflation. Already, I think, has had the effect of suppressing expectations of inflation. In terms of fiscal policy, there's not a lot to be done. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, which just passed the Senate yesterday and will likely pass the House this week, I don't think the name is perhaps fitting. I don't think it will significantly reduce inflation, but it won't increase inflation because it has a net negative effect on the budget deficit. Perhaps a policy that could have some impact would be to reduce or eliminate the tariffs that were imposed during the trade war years of 2018 through 2020. Those tariffs were inflationary, and reducing tariffs would have the effect of reducing prices of imported goods and creating more competition for domestic producers, putting pressure on them to reduce at least price increases. So that, in my mind, would be the one policy area that could have the greatest impact other than monetary policy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And maybe a follow-on from our audience. We've gotten this in a couple of different variations, and so let me just draw it to a theme. are other countries, as you look globally, are other countries experiencing inflation in tight labor markets to a similar degree, maybe greater or lesser than the US? Just expand it for a minute globally.
Yes, so certainly many others are. Here in North America, Canada has a similar inflation rate to us and a very rapid tightening of monetary policy, and Western Europe as well. In the Eurozone, the inflation rate is almost as high as in the US. In the UK, it's even higher. And in both locations, monetary policy is being tightened, although less severely in the Eurozone, because I think the European Central Bank recognizes that the inflation in Europe is disproportionately more related to energy prices than it is here, and that the European economy is weaker and greater at risk of recession, in part because of the war and what the Russians might do on natural gas. Interestingly, inflation hasn't been as big of a problem in East Asia. Inflation remains relatively low in Japan and China. It has accelerated in Japan, but the Bank of Japan has not tightened monetary policy. And inflation has been an issue in many emerging countries. In fact, what we've seen with the tightening of US monetary policy is a rise in capital outflows from emerging countries to the US. This has put downward pressure on their currencies, which would be inflationary, but it's also compelled them to tighten their monetary policies in order to stabilize their currencies. But that's at the risk of slowing economic growth or even leading to recession. So it is a mixed bag, but on balance, in the developed world, we're mostly seeing a confluence of inflation, and largely for the same reasons, because of the disruption of the pandemic and the change in consumer behavior, and then the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Really helpful in helping our audience sort of pull this together. Maybe one last question in the remaining minute or so. You've talked about inflation, you've talked about tight labor supply. How do you see immigration policy? Presumably, this question is really more focused on the US, but US immigration policy as a source of additional labor supply.
Well, we did see, even before the pandemic, the previous administration had a relatively restrictive policy toward immigration, and then that worsened during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And so if you look at data on the number of workers born outside the United States as a share of the total, it's now significantly lower than it was a few years ago. So we've had a paucity of immigration, and that has contributed significantly to the shortage of labor that we're now experiencing, especially in some industries that are heavily dependent on immigrant labor, like agriculture, construction, some parts of transportation. My view is that we need to reverse that we need more immigration. And if we get it, that will have the effect of reducing the shortage of labor, reducing potential pressure on labor costs and therefore on inflation. The data suggests that we benefit from immigration, but right now politically, it's a no-win situation for either political party to favor a dramatic increase in immigration.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. We'll leave it there. I want to thank you again, Ira, for the terrific insights, incisive analysis, and really helping us to set the context for our considerations of macroeconomic and geopolitical risks in the context of audits. That backdrop really helps us now as we pivot. I would like to pivot in saying thank you, Ira, and welcome to three panelists, distinguished panelists, who are both friends and leaders across the profession. Phillip Austin is the National Managing Partner of Professional Practice and Auditing at BDO. Phillip, welcome.
Thank you,
Jennifer Nice to see you. And Jennifer is the Chief Auditor, Audit Methodology and Standards at Grant Thornton. And Jim Estes. Jim is a Vice Chair of EY for EY Americas and Head of Professional Practice. Thank you for joining us in a virtual panel discussion, but one that enables us to really take the terrific discussion from Ira and bring it a little closer to what we deal with every day on the audit side, the reporting side, disclosures, and ultimately the relevance of the work we do in advancing high quality, very relevant reporting in the markets. So maybe with that as the tee up, I know time will go very quickly. We have 4 big topics that we wanted to cover. First, we'll cover the financial reporting environment. We'll make it real there. Then we'll cover the macroeconomic factors that we see in the context of audits and reporting. We'll turn then to geopolitical factors. And importantly, I'll keep us moving, or I hope to keep us moving enough to land on time for Q&A as well. So let me just pause there. Jim, Jennifer, Philip, sound good?
Perfect.
Sounds
Okay.
great.
Well, thanks very much. Maybe with that, let's jump in. Let's jump into the financial reporting environment. This is one that starts really with 2 important concepts that sometimes, at least colloquially, is used interchangeably: risk and uncertainty. And for those in our audience who spend a lot of time in thinking about risk or thinking about uncertainty or thinking about both of them, know there are distinctions between those concepts. The concept of risk is one where the outcome is unknown, but the statistical possibilities are generally understood. So you could do a statistical distribution of risk and help reach a decision. Projects and the outcome of project cash flows is just one basic example. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is where the outcomes aren't known and their likelihood also is not known. And that's where expertise really comes in. As auditors, we deal with both because business models in the marketplace, of course, involve both. And so maybe with that tee up, Jim, let me come to you first. I know you've seen this across cycles, across business models over time. How is the operating and financial reporting environment affected by an environment that I would say many characterize as high risk versus one that maybe is characterized as highly uncertain? If you would, let's get the conversation sort of started with that angle. Is that okay, Jim?
Absolutely, yeah. And Wes, I agree with some of your comments there. I do think the concepts are often very much interrelated. But maybe a couple of examples to start getting that conversation going. As you say, I think about highly uncertain environments make determining future cash flows for a company and for auditing those by an auditor very, very difficult. And anytime there is prospective financial information, or PFI, as we sometimes refer to that, anytime that is required in an uncertain environment, that's very difficult to be able to determine what those outcomes may be. And some of those difficulties and how they manifest themselves, you can in the financial statements, think about goodwill impairments and how difficult an evaluation of a goodwill impairment test would be in a highly uncertain environment. Similar for business combinations and making fair value determinations in a business combination. And then, of course, throughout the financial statements, there's other areas where fair value calculations are important. And any time we have this environment, those become extremely difficult for a preparer to be able to prepare or for an auditor to be able to audit. And maybe, and one other thought I would give would be around disclosures. And I would say equally important are the disclosure considerations by a company. And so in a high risk environment, obviously that's something that can and must be disclosed. It really gives a preparer sort of the opportunity as well as the obligation to ensure that there's an adequate understanding of that range of possible outcomes that you described is disclosed in the financial statements, and an opportunity to be forthright about those risks. And so this to make essentially ensure that investors understand that range of possible outcomes in an environment that's high risk.
Jim, really, really helpful in applying that concept of risk to a number of different places within the context of the audit. Phillip, let me come to you next on uncertainty. Phillip, you see this across the marketplace as well. How do you see uncertainty in the assurance process really coming to the surface?
As I'd start with a reflection on 2020. I think the experience uniformly for preparers, investors, and auditors in the early part of the pandemic was uncertainty as you describe it. And one of the things we learned out of that uncertainty is there is no precise prediction of what happens next. And that probably is what creates the assurance problem. Preparers are looking and taking a view on what they think will happen with uncertainty. Investors have a different point of view, and we saw that as we watched equities move in ways that most commentators would say didn't quite line up with consensus views on what would happen next, both positive and negative. And the assurance model sits in the center of that, providing some form of comfort. And in a period of uncertainty, you lose a lot of things. There's no past experience to rely on. There's no certainty of what happens next. You have to worry about preparers having their own biases. They're trying to tell a story. They're trying to suggest an outcome. And that may not line up with all of the factors in front of you. So contradictory evidence abounds. And the expertise model goes up significantly. What you're trying to do as an assurance provider is understand, did management consider all of the possibilities? Do they give at least a reasonably objective weight? There's no fully objective weight to those possibilities. And then are they suitably disclosed in a way that users can use them well? That requires advanced understanding of business. It requires an acutely curious mind. It requires broad acumen. And it requires auditors who are willing to sometimes look management in the eye and say, I hear your point of view, but you haven't thought of everything. Here's something else we need to think through very hard and respond to. And that makes life as an assurance provider interesting, difficult, and probably is why most of us on this call have a passion for what we do.
Phillip, it's a really good tee up, for the next question, Jennifer, if I can bring you into the conversation as well. And that is in looking at the way risk and uncertainty impacts our clients. Phillip, you made the point about how it's coming through a business model and our role in approaching with healthy skepticism and challenge in understanding that. Operationally, Jennifer, as you know, risk and uncertainty, it can be dealt with by a business and a business model by avoiding it, by shifting it, or by sharing it. Three fundamental elements there. And given the quantity of issues that Ira talked about, or Jim or Phillip referenced, given the quantity of those, given the interlocking and overlapping nature of those, sometimes the parameters of models that we've looked at in the past to really inform risk management become stretched or even exceeded in their utility for anticipating how to make moves going forward. So what could we see operationally in response to residual amounts of risk and uncertainty embedded in business models. And then how do you see that from an auditor perspective in thinking about going concern assessments or impairment assessments and the like? How do you see those issues?
Well, I think Wes, and Jim and Phillip both made a lot of really excellent points in the challenges, right? I think historically, as preparers and auditors, we've said to ourselves, well, history is generally a good predictor of the future. And we can look at historically what happens when certain events happen and see what that does in the market. And I don't think there is a history of a global pandemic, a war on the European continent, et cetera, all at the same time. So it's really difficult to make those risk assessment decisions for a company. I think we're going to see a lot of, the supply chain issues, right? How do we become less reliant on the distance that our supply has to travel or our reliance on a particular supplier? So we're making decisions like that, but we're also making decisions operationally that we haven't historically made. And so it's difficult to predict what the outcome of that decision may be. So the preparers are then injecting more uncertainty into their projection or cash flow estimation process. And as a result, it's also difficult for them to support those projections, right? And I think Phillip made the great point of they got to think about they're biased in telling their story and they want to remain with that story, but have they thought of everything? And here comes the auditor that's going to challenge them on the three things they didn't think of, right? But what about this? What about that? And so I think you're going to have a lot more, once you go through this really difficult risk assessment process and determining all of the things, now you're going to get quizzed on it. And someone's going to ask you about 12 things that you didn't think about. And you got to have a response to that, right? And layered into that is how does it impact your internal controls, et cetera? And the train starts to roll. So I do think it's certainly times where we've not seen before, and it's going to be difficult for both preparers and auditors. And I think it's a time when communication is of utmost importance, right? Within an organization and then with your auditor.
Great point. And it's a good transition really into the macroeconomic factors. This is the second topic we wanted to be certain we hit. And just sticking with your point, Jennifer, about the conversations between the audit partner and an audit committee or a management team about the impact of macroeconomic circumstances. The CAQ did a poll survey of audit partners to really get a sense for where the conversation is, but also to be transparent about where the conversation is, and that helps audit committees and management teams really understand top-level issues. What it found was that inflation, labor shortages, and supply chain disruptions are among the top 3 economic risks that preparers are anticipated to contend with over the next 12 months. And so maybe, Jennifer, just sticking with you, how do you see preparers responding to the effects of, say, monetary policy in the context of those 3 high-level economic risks?
Well, I think we're seeing that issuers are certainly reevaluating investments, bolstering cash. We're a little bit, at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was hoarding cash, right? I think we're seeing some of that. They're certainly reconsidering the cost of capital versus borrowing. What are our strategies to best preserve our cash position or our liquidity position given uncertain times? At least that's what we're seeing.
Great point. Liquidity, cash is king, access to capital resources. Jim, let me pull you into the discussion as well. If companies are applying, a combination of tools, maybe it's liquidity on their balance sheet, maybe it's a review of the business model. How does that inform on the auditor side planning on the risk assessment or the execution or the reporting side of the audit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll pick up a little bit on on some of Jennifer's comments, and I do think some examples, companies may be changing investment strategies in an environment like this, which need to be factored in by an audit engagement team and in establishing their audit strategy. So, for example, an investment portfolio and short-term investments changing to other types of investments is something that needs to be well understood and needs to be known that it occurred by the audit team so they can make those changes. Companies' own debt terms might be restructured in an environment like this. So variable rate debt might be restructured into longer term fixed rate type instruments. So I think it's one of those that the audit team has to be very alert in that risk assessment process of understanding these changes and then making sure that they are making changes to the audit strategy. I think this is a great example of the importance of professional skepticism by an audit team. And what I mean by that is I think an auditor cannot set the audit strategy like we're talking about as part of this risk assessment phase and audit strategy based on what he or she may think they know about the company. Even in an environment where they may have been the auditors of a particular company for a long time, things may have changed, especially in an environment like we're talking about today. So the importance of a proper risk assessment every year and substantiating what you think you know about a company as part of that process and documenting the basis for that risk assessment is something that's just extremely important in an environment like this particularly. And then the last thing I would just mention is in all of these instances, this is something that the auditor is going to want to make sure that there's a robust discussion with the audit committee about.
Terrific points. And Phillip, let me come to you next as we shift from sort of liquidity to that second element in the CAQ poll survey, tight labor market. That impacts the availability, the supply of auditors. How we see universities reporting significant declines in the number of students. Things are tight. So what are some of the factors that are more specific to the profession that make recruiting or retention a challenge that as leaders in the profession we're dealing with? How do you see that, Phillip?
And it's interesting, Wes, you saw those charts from IRA. There's another chart that flies around, and that's the net deficit of accounting major graduates, which runs, depending on which survey you look at, around about 50 or 60,000 more jobs a year than accounting graduates in the US for the next decade. And that comes off of the last 5 years. You factor that in and you say, well, okay, that's clear. We have a real shortage of people coming in. You add to that what IRA referred to as the immigration deficit, and I knew it was bad. I didn't quite realize 70% of our new labor came from immigration. And we're at the back end of at least 6 years of it being incredibly hard to bring qualified auditors, people interested in what we do, into the United States. And then you have to think about the overemployment. And overemployment drives choice, and choice is a good thing. But choice in a labor shortage environment also means that the people who work within auditing firms are always looking for other options. So then you come down to the thing we can control, and that's the nature of what work people do, how they do the work, who does the work, and who they work with. And that probably is where most of the profession's focus is. Looking at alternate graduation paths, can we gain credible roles for people in audit outside of the traditional accounting majors? Looking at using new methods. You heard Laura describing that in her remarks, and I know each firm on this panel has a work stream looking at how you change the nature of work using technology to automate things that are about assembly and acquiring of information, accelerating the progression path so that a college graduate gets to more senior levels more quickly, and look at industry specialization. And then we're looking at ways of changing work sequence. Most firms have found that there are people who want to do a piece of what an audit is and do it incredibly well under a negotiated time frame. And I think the age that at least I grew up in, of auditors going around like a maze of a honey field where you go to different kind of flowers and learn many, many different things and then settle in, I think that's going to be inverted. I think it's going to be more a case of many of our professionals settling into things they love doing, focusing deeply on that vertical, and many of them may never leave that vertical. So I think it's a combination of change who we recruit, change how we work, change what work is done by automation, and then giving people a very different career path set of choices. And that's the only way we're going to solve the conundrum we're in.
Yeah, it's really, really an important point that as we look at human capital and labor, the nature of the work really comes to the forefront and how we deliver that. And Jennifer, let me come to you on that point about the nature of the work changing, both in the foundational elements, as Phillip talked about, but also other risks that are rising in their significance, the significance of the work that auditors do. One of those areas is assurance around climate risk, climate-related information, whether it's non-financial disclosure or the financial effects of climate on a given company. There are other ESG matters as well, of course. From that same CAQ audit partner pulse survey, nearly half of the people who responded to the survey indicated that climate-related risks are a top long-term priority for companies in the future. 4 in 10, 40%, said that companies will focus on enhancing sustainability reporting. So nature of risks coming into the process and the availability of additional disclosure certainly on the rise. How do those factors affect the attractiveness of the profession from your perspective? How do you see that coming into the discussion?
Well, certainly, Phillip made a great point of, you as an auditor in the financial statements, you're doing your little bits and it all comes together. It's certainly something different to do, right? And as these practices as issuers are focusing more and more on what they say about ESG and sustainability, and the SEC has some proposals out there about how you report on that and how auditors fit into that. I think we're certainly seeing a growth in an area that hasn't existed before. So it's assurance around things that aren't necessarily financial statement related. And it's in a topic that people, especially our younger generation of people, are really interested in. So I think it creates an opportunity for us to provide a new area that has interesting work that may not be associated directly with the financial statements as it has been in the past. We're certainly seeing an increase in the number, as we grow our practice in this area and post for opportunities for our people. We're certainly seeing lots of auditors choose that path, right? It's always one, ooh, I can go do something new and exciting that isn't, auditing prospective financial information related to goodwill impairment, which, as interesting as that is, maybe doing some assurance work on greenhouse gas emissions proves to be a little bit more interesting, and I can use my assurance related skills and apply it to a different topic. At the same time, I also think we're seeing an increase in the number of people that the firms are hiring that aren't necessarily accounting majors, right? Whether it's people who have degrees in data analysis or the ability to mine data, or that know lots about the environmental issues that are being faced. So it's a whole bunch of different types of subjects that aren't necessarily accounting that are attracting or that we're looking for in filling our open positions.
Thanks, Jennifer. We lost Wes for just a moment there, but I think the four of us can carry on until he gets back with us. Yeah, that brings us to geopolitical factors, which of course is really important in this three-bar conversation we're having today. And I think, Jennifer, you made the point earlier, as did Ira, that this question of globalization and reshoring, of being able to get our supply chains into good shape, continues to be a challenge. And I guess, Jim, as we think about that, what are some of the things you're seeing preparers do in the short term to deal with resource challenges, supply chain shortages, and just respond to the reality of a shifting thinking from just in time, I can immediately get a supply, I have alternatives, to I may not have alternatives. And I'm also reminded in this conversation of an example I heard from a pharmaceutical executive who said their single issue was the front end of the syringe, the little needle. Everything else they could get, but that one piece was challenging them. So I don't know, Jim, I know you've got some thoughts in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got maybe a few things I would add. Maybe to start off with, we've been referring to this pulse survey that the CAQ conducted, and here again, I guess I would quote a topic there where, in that survey, the vast majority of partners that responded to that survey from multiple industries was that price increases is what to expect to address some of the inflation attributable to these demand surges, and that's expected really across all industries. But I think there's other ways as well that we'll see this. I do think there have been various reports in the news, and I'm sure many of you have seen reports of inventory days increasing by manufacturers, and that's a trend that some refer to as just-in-case inventories rather than just-in-time inventories. So inventory levels will be increased, and of course there is a cost to that. But there are always exceptions to that. So as soon as I make that point, I guess I would also say there's an exception. I personally experienced one. It's probably worth mentioning, and that's with respect to the automotive industry, where there are far less new cars on the showroom floor, for example. And I was recently talking to the owner of a dealership who had said, we will never go back to the model we had before. And because they have actually found this to have improvements to their model to be able to go to something where the consumer is actually ordering a vehicle, and it apparently gives them better pricing leverage as well. So in not every industry will we see an increase in inventory days, but most assuredly that will be the majority of companies. And then I guess with respect to supply chain, last thing I would mention is that companies are also establishing alternative or multiple suppliers for some of those same components that they bought from a main supplier in the past. So some of those key inventory components, Phillip, kind of like you just gave an example of, to reduce what Ira mentioned earlier in his remarks as supply chain stress. I think we'll see more and more companies reducing that supply chain stress and thus reducing what they believe is risk to themselves.
So I'm Margot Cello with the Center for Audit Quality. We are desperately trying to get Wes back, but Phillip, in the meantime, until he gets back, there have been economic sanctions against Russian companies, which has prompted withdrawals from many public companies and audit firms alike. So what are the expectations for the financial statement effects of preparers' divestments from the Russian and Belarusian operations for fiscal year 2022 and possibly even beyond?
It's interesting, Margot, how the last year has changed the conversation for preparers. Most of them felt they were able to segregate their assets by geographic border and retain an interest from a distance. What this sanction regime has proved is that forced exit remains an instrument in the political regime. And as that has occurred across many markets, and it's not just the US, UK, European Union, Australia, there have been many very strong sanction regimes. You've seen all kinds of dislocation. And some of that dislocation is easy to articulate. The company's assets within the country borders of Russia, Belarus are now stranded. Those assets are no longer accessible to the corporation from a distance. And those ones are a little easier to boundary, and typical impairment models and walkaway models for disclosure works well. But you also have all the downstream impact of companies that are in some kind of interaction. The latest one, which I think you would have seen articulated well, was this question of aircraft leaseholders and trying to get their assets back, trying to secure their lease futures. Really tough business decisions for those asset holders. And then you have companies where their throughput is through one of those territories. So while they may not have a direct asset within, they're having to replace a supply chain or a resource model, or find a different solution to support their back office, including accounting, technical and design work that's done within Russia and Belarus. So what that gives you is a lot of country-specific risk. And we've spoken today about disclosure, and those are important, and then measurement, trying to measure those uncertainties. Will this change? Will we see the sanction regime lessen? Will we see a return to whatever one might call normalization? Were that to occur, does a company gain access to its assets? If it does gain access to its assets, one little side thing that will show up very quickly is the distinct difference between US GAAP and IFRS in the once written off model as opposed to the IFRS reset model, which could see over the next couple of years some assets held being reset under an IFRS reporting model, but held at a written down model under US GAAP. So a lot of interesting things ahead of us, all of it uncertain, all of it depending on what happens outside and how that impacts us then inside. Wes, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Philip. You know, this is just a demonstration of teaming, critical for any good audit, but also the very realities of supply chain and technology and how that all comes together. Unfortunately, my laptop decided that it would lose its last leg right during our discussion, but I was set with a backup here. So I know, thank you. We've talked about the macro pieces. We've transitioned into the cyber discussion. I was able to hear, I think, most of that. Jennifer, anything more you'd want to say about the audit aspects of cyber? And if you've already covered it, that's fine. We'll jump into Q&A.
No, that's great. Thanks, Wes. I guess what I would add here is, you know, as we come off talking about Russia and sanctions, and even today they're saying, you know, we're getting more and more risk, getting closer to a time when it's more likely that Russia will increase their rate of cyber attack. So we're certainly seeing that security breaches are occurring more frequently, and they're distributed across industries. You know, when we first started talking about cyber risk, we focused on businesses or types of businesses that had lots of personal information. But now we're finding it's infrastructure, it's just absolute cyber warfare on any kind of company. So it's occurring in all different types of industries via different mechanisms with different goals in mind. And don't forget, while there are requirements to report cyber breaches and things like that for public or listed entities, we're finding more and more security breaches are being introduced through the private company mechanism. And that's outside the jurisdiction of the SEC, which is also challenging for our issuers. So you could have a cyber breach that comes via one of your vendors or customers that's not a public company, right? And then it ends up in your systems. So it's certainly a challenge to be ever more vigilant about where are all the points that somebody can get in. And if they do get in, then what are the things that I have to protect myself beyond that? So it's certainly an ever moving, ever challenging, you know, and I like to say in the audit environment, you know, we reserve the right to get smarter, but our cyber attackers are also getting smarter as we go along. So it's a real challenge for everybody, I think.
Yeah, really well said. And thank you for those points. It's multi-layered, it's multi-dimensional, it cuts across reporting systems and operating systems. Maybe transitioning then from cyber to some of the Q&A. And let me just pause here for the audience. Thank you for the questions that we've received already. A handful of questions have come in. For the panel, please get those in. We've 8 minutes for questions. So let me, there are 2 questions here that really get to labor shortages within the profession and with a real focus on domestic entry-level professionals. And Phillip, I think you made the point that there's the impact of automation. Nature of jobs are changing. We've all talked about the point that the nature of expertise that goes into being an entry level is shifting. Jennifer, you made that point around climate. What do you see as sort of this point about the decline in accounting students at an entry level? It's multi-layered, of course. We won't be able to unpack all of that, but just at a top level, maybe we could go around the horn. What do you see as contributing that, or even what are the right questions? Some ask questions about, do we have salaries at the right level? Some ask questions, do we have an attractive career? Is there enough information about the nature of the career? Phillip, maybe starting with you and then just going around the horn on that.
Yeah, Wes, you're right about the questions, and I'll start off with what attracts people to a career that's going to take them 7 years to get going, 4 years at college, 3 years at work, and what attracts you at that point may not be what we think attracts somebody in the workforce. And I think that probably for us as a profession, we have to get right. There are ample high school graduates, about 3.5 million a year, and the accounting profession is attracting fewer and fewer of them. We have to be introspective and ask, well, what are we doing that encourages somebody not to set themselves on that path? Because we have a college entry point problem. We may address retention later on, and we should, and may address nature of work, and we should. But you do need initial hires to start with, and those hires start their journey 4 years before they leave college. And there are many reasons along the way that they may or may not think what we do is worth doing.
Really good point. Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree with everything Phillip said. And, I think that it's interesting. One of the things I'm on the board of the Illinois CPA Society, and one of the things we talk about as a board for the society is the same thing, right? And a lot of people say, it's the 5-year requirement, but when you dig into it, it's not really the 5-year requirement. It's other things. And, it's really, how do we make the profession attractive to high school students? And it's, and how do we make the profession more diverse? That's another, that may also be one of the barriers for people entering, is people may see it as not sufficiently diverse in its composition. And so I think we have, a challenging environment that, yes, there's fewer graduates, but we also have to up the diversity of the graduates that are out there. And in some ways, I think part of it is that we as people who've been in the profession for a long time need to sing its great praises. And our young people look at, do I really want a job where I work 70 hours a week for, probably 6 or 7 months of the year? They're not sure about that, right? So there are things that we have to do to also make the profession a little bit more attractive. I think, it's going to be a real challenge. There's also a massive just decline in the population, right? There's a decrease in the number of 18-year-olds and people who will be entering colleges. Colleges are also really trying to get people. So it's a challenge. I don't know what the answers are. Too many things happening at one time.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I would say, Wes, as Jennifer said, that I would come back to Ira's comment on immigration. I did a fun thing during the pandemic. We were looking for people, as we all are. So I posted we're looking for people on my LinkedIn, and I've got over 1,500 people apply, but 1,400 of them were outside the US.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's enormous, enormous potential whenever you widen out to a global level. Yeah. Jim, anything you'd add from your vantage point of it?
Well, I think, one thing that should be already exceedingly clear is there's not one silver bullet to this issue. There's so many facets to this, and I think it is important that the funnel of those coming into the profession be expanded. And I think we all have a responsibility to find ways to ensure that more and more people want to enter the profession. Then I think the profession has a responsibility, and I think all of us are working on this very, very hard, but we have a responsibility then of making sure that we make this a place that lives up to the career that these individuals hoped they would have, and so that it has great purpose. It has an opportunity for people to be together. I think that was one of the challenges we had during the pandemic, was all of our people ended up going back and working in solitude in their homes. And one of the most valuable things in the profession, I speak for myself when I say this, was the ability to work together and to be together. And so that's one of those elements, I think, to making this profession live up to what someone would hope. And I think also varying the career opportunities that a person has coming into the profession. It's really not one-dimensional. There's many ways a person can go, and I think we have that responsibility of building those as well.
All really good points, and it's Jim, to your point, it's that inspiration that people can really build a career that fits for them. They can have the impact. There's also the reality along the way, and there was an aspect of the question that came in around salaries and are salaries competitive. I just share from my perspective, salaries is certainly an important piece of it. Entry level graduates sort of look at earnings opportunities, but it's just a piece of it. The labor market has been adjusting. Salaries are up across the profession. And so, of course, it should continue to be studied. The data, I think, will reflect a much more significant rise in accounting salaries relative to some of the other professions. But that'll never take the place of meaning and inspiration and the variety of work as we've talked about here. So having said all that, maybe just a quick round the robin, 30 seconds or less. Any quick takeaways from the panelists before we head off into a break? Jennifer, can I start with you? Just a quick take.
Sure. I think the last point you made there, Wes, was creating meaningful work. And we keep hearing that more and more. And I suspect it's not just in the audit firms, it's also at the issuers, right? Because there's a shortage of financial reporting people at the issuers, right? It all sort of feeds itself together and making sure we create meaningful work. And Jim's point about being together, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, oh, they took all the fun out of audit, because the fun was the conference room and the snacks and and spending time with the client face to face. And so they hopefully we can get all that back in in the new normal, as it were. So I think those are the things I think about today.
Yeah, really good. Phillip?
Wes, I come back again and again. This has been my life's work, being in this profession. Assurance is in high demand. Macroeconomic, geopolitical uncertainty creates the need for confidence and trust in financial information. And if we sell that purpose and sell it well, we have a ripe condition for gaining people in. People want to do things that have meaning. So I think if we stitch all of these topics together, there have been very few times in history that our profession has been more attractive for what we do for society.
So well said. Jim?
I would just say that I think it's fair to say that everyone on this call today and in this symposium is really part of the ecosystem of this profession. And I think all of us have a responsibility, and really it's an honor to have a piece of this responsibility to make this profession what it needs to be and to be able to have more people enter the profession. So I think that's on us. And as I say, that's something I'm really proud to be a part of.
Mhm. Well, I'll leave it there. So well said. Let me just underscore the discussion. Macroeconomic and geopolitical, highly uncertain, a lot of risk. But we've got the confidence that with the right expertise, the right skill, we will be relevant. We will convey that trust. We will deliver on the purpose, but we'll do that in close connection with everyone in the symposium today. It takes all of us, and Jim, you made the point well, it takes all of us working together, communicating, understanding the impact of our work and how we can always consistently have a learning culture of bringing that back and expanding as a profession.